Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Resuming Debate. I'm losing my voice a bit today. That is the wild end of session situation we have here in Parliament. And if you're new to Resuming Debate, we talk about big topical issues in Canada, but we also sometimes try to take a bit of a step back and analyze them from a different angle. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Keith Roy, who's a realtor out on the West Coast. He's been very involved in the Monarchist League in Canada in the past, and I wanted to talk about the monarchy, the Canadian monarchy. Two main reasons. The first is that we have the recent ascension to the throne of Charles III as King of Canada, and let's acknowledge he's a potentially controversial figure. He became king around the time many people were watching the Crown and becoming aware of again, or for the first time, of some of the let's acknowledge scandalous events associated with his younger life. And then also he's someone who has political positions that he's spoken about and been engaged on, although he's certainly said he's going to take a step back from that kind of work in his new role. So that's one kind of interesting story that's going on. But the other is the kind of the top issue here in Ottawa right now. The foreign interference scandal has seen the Prime Minister try to give himself some cover by appointing a former Governor General, David Johnston, to act as a kind of special rapporteur, kind of from my perspective, a bit of a fake role, and maybe providing a bit of cover to the Prime Minister. And there's been a lot of discussion about David Johnston, but I don't know that there's been a lot of discussion in the media about what this means for perceptions of the monarchy, of the vice-regal role in this country when you have a former Governor General kind of very much back in the cut and thrust of political debate. So Keith, thank you so much for joining us as a committed monarchist to help us make sense of some of these headlines and talk about the state of the monarchy in Canada.
I also just enjoy the concept of debate. So great podcast.
Excellent. Let's start with kind of the current headline. Are you surprised that David Johnston is doing what he is doing, and what impact do you think the debates around his role have on perception of his former office of Governors General in general?
Yeah, I've met Mr. Johnston a couple of times. I don't by any stretch know him, but I've met him a number of times, and obviously was a keen observer of his during his very long tenure as Governor General. He is a remarkable, upstanding, dedicated Canadian. And in this scenario, I think what happened is the Prime Minister called him. And when the Prime Minister calls on you, or the President calls on you, or the Leader of your nation calls on you to perform a service, for someone like him, you're inclined to do so. I was disappointed when he took the position. And much like you, I looked at it and I thought, there's no way this ends well. Like you don't want to get in bed with the government on this issue. It's going to end poorly for you. And it hasn't ended poorly for him yet, but the consensus that I've seen, and you're closer to it than I am, the consensus I've seen is that he's going to resign at some point. Like this just doesn't end well for him. It's bad on his reputation. It's going to be bad for the Prime Minister. The only obvious outcome to this, I'm sitting out here on the West Coast, the only obvious outcome to this is a public inquiry. Like this is the monarchy is an institution of Canada. Constitutional monarchy is an institution, but so are elections, and so is the House of Commons, and so is the Senate. And one of those elections is one of those institutions is under threat. And you've kind of interwoven an individual from one of them into the other one. Yeah, it's a bad scene, and I think it reflects most poorly on the Prime Minister. And I feel sorry for Mr. Johnston getting brought into this, but I think he had noble reasons for doing so.
Yeah, that's an interesting and I think nuanced take on it. I guess I might counter with this, though. I mean, I understand the appeal of saying if the leader of your nation calls on you to serve, you have some patriotic responsibility to take that call seriously. But on the other hand, he wasn't being called to serve in a kind of well, I mean, maybe he conceived of it differently, but the way I would conceive of it is that he was not really being called upon to serve in a kind of a neutral service to the nation kind of role. He was being called to fill a role that involved service to the Prime Minister and was conceived of as a way of providing the Prime Minister with political cover, which is very different from if the Prime Minister had asked him to serve in a role like the Governor General, right? The Governor General is a nonpartisan service role. So, I can
don't
think for myself, if I was a private citizen and a Liberal Prime Minister asked me to take on certain kinds of roles, I might say yes. And if they asked me to take on certain other kinds of roles, I would say no. And it would depend on whether I was serving the government, the Prime Minister, or Canada as a whole.
I think as this story's unfolded, I think the Prime Minister's intentions have become more clear. I think at the time, I'm going to give David Johnston the benefit of the doubt that he was trying to be of service to Canadians. And I think once he came to the conclusion, maybe he hasn't yet, that, oh, wait a second, I'm here to give political cover on something that's clearly damaging to the government of the day, he should have stepped aside or, quite frankly, called for a public inquiry. But I don't think he went into it with this. I didn't get the impression from anything in his history or in his acceptance of the position that this was some sort of backroom deal between Mr. Johnston and the Prime Minister to give him cover. I think it's partly been framed by that very effectively by the Conservatives, but just the reality of the situation, I think, supports the Conservatives' argument on this. And I think Mr. Johnston is probably at a point where he's going to need to step aside at some point, or there should have just been a public inquiry. This is a fundamental institution of Canadian democracy, the holding of an election. And everybody agrees at this point that the elections have been tampered with by foreign interference. I see no dissenting opinion on this. The dissension is whether or not the outcome would have changed. And even then, most people don't think the outcome would have changed, save a couple seats here and there. We'd still have the same prime minister, but guys like, Kenny Chiu might still be back in parliament, which is frightening and important and worth conversation. But I don't think this was backroom cover by the Prime Minister and David Johnston. But the perception of it makes it a reality. And this reflects poorly on him. I'm not sure it reflects poorly back on the institution of the Crown. It's because his record as Governor General is basically flawless. He was one of, if not the greatest Governor General in Canadian history. He served long. He was very effective in his service. He traveled the country extensively. He was beloved by all parties. He was beloved by most Canadians. So I will leave him with that legacy. I think this tarnishes his personal brand going forward, but I don't think it reaches back into the annals of history and pulls down the Crown because he got tied up in a Trudeau foreign interference scandal.
In terms of the office of Governor General, I think it's fair to say that most people would not have known who David Johnston was until he became Governor General. And the Prime Minister, in kind of using him in this role, but also using him previously in the role he played for the Debates Commission, was trying to trade on a good name that, not to take away from his prior activities, but that a good name in the eyes of most Canadians that stemmed directly from his time as Governor General. So is it a problem if people become, if someone takes on the role of Governor General, they serve very ably in that role, but then they're able to trade on the kind of nonpartisan credibility to do things that after they were Governor General that are maybe outside of the scope of that role? Should people remain nonpartisan and outside of the cut and thrust of politics kind of after they've served in that role?
Yeah, let's not forget. I mean, he was appointed by Stephen Harper.
Yeah.
So he's not some liberal shill that got thrust into the office of Governor General. The claim that could have been made on perhaps some of the previous governors general through the Chrétien area, et cetera, where there was that incestual relationship between the Liberal Party and the CBC and the Governor General's office. That was a little more clear cut. Mr. Johnston was appointed by Mr. Harper. He was widely respected throughout his term. The Debates Commission, I agree with you. I don't think Mr. Bernier should have been there, which is really where you're hinting at with where he went wrong with that particular job. That was poor form. I don't think the nation was served by having that voice there. And I think only one party was damaged by having that voice there. So we were no better.
I think the debates were terrible beyond that, right?
Yeah.
Like not that people did, but like there was so much like.
I mean,
and now we're going to hear from this other person. Like there's just way too many.
Yeah, like let's just run the two people who have a chance of being prime minister. I'd like to see the head-to-head The problem there is there was that time that Jack Layton almost took a run at it, and he wouldn't have otherwise been included if not for that format. So Canada's this weird mix, and I mean, he didn't come close, but he did get the number 2 spot. Jack Layton became the prime minister in waiting. So is it a head-to-head? Is it a 3-person debate? They're having, what were we at, 6 of them up there at that point. That was a little absurd, and no one was served well. And you, more than many people in the world, are really in the weeds on debate. You run a whole podcast on the topic. So you've thought about it a little more than most. Most people are just like, these guys are just screaming at each other. It looks like question period, but it's like worse. It's like worse than question period. So, should governors general be able to trade on their job? Well, yeah. I mean, should members of parliament be able to continue to comment on things after they've left parliament? You're in there for a very limited time, with a few exceptions. You've dedicated your life, in Mr. Johnston's case, for 7 years to a very public and taxing role. And he has to have some purpose and continuity, and his area of expertise is around governmental institutions. So he plays a role in that. And I think that's reasonable. I don't think he should be doing what he's doing right now. On the Debates Commission, I think he did an okay job with a odd group of, where again, 5 or 6 people who we had to control, and various media thing. Like, we haven't had a great debate in Canada for a long time. That wasn't a function of him. That's just a function of the system.
Yeah,
So,
I don't want to get too sidetracked on the question of debates. I mean, it does speak, I think, sometimes to this Canadian impulse that is like, okay, we need to have this coming together of the powers that be to figure out a perfect coordinated format. Actually, I think we saw some really good debates in the 2015 election when there wasn't the same sort of central control, and you had different kinds of debates. You had one debate that was on foreign policy by just 3 of the leaders, and you had a lot of good head-to-head. But then you had other debates that included a broader range of voices, so you had a little bit more. But aside from the question of that, I mean, to zero in on the vice-regal role, like, let's take a clear-cut example than David Johnston, right? So I was just remembering Ed Schreier, right? He was a governor general who actually, post being the governor general, came back and ran as an NDP candidate following being in office. And why I'm inclined to think that that's different from a former MP expressing their political opinions is that when you take on the role of governor general, you're stepping into an institution where you are, very much expected to and need to be separate from political debate, and you need to give and receive a kind of credibility that allows you to do that. When you do that for a period of time and then you go back to run for parliament again, does that send the message that you never really put aside your jersey, or is that just a reality that was inevitably the case anyways?
Oh, well, look, he wasn't appointed by he wasn't appointed on the advice of an NDP prime minister.
Right.
He was appointed on the advice of a different party. So he obviously had enough nonpartisanship, or enough range of partisanship. I don't think anyone's entirely nonpartisan, but I think in the role of the governor general, your range needs to be a little broader than perhaps a member of parliament from Saskatchewan would need to be. He managed to hold the confidence of a broad enough selection of people that he was able to do the job. I don't know. Lives are long and things change. Like, what does that mean? Every governor general can't participate in political discourse after they've left the role. That's pretty tough pill to swallow. I'm not entirely convinced they should all be running for office afterwards. Mm-hmm. But Mr. Schreier was a unique case, and I can't think of any other case where that occurred.
Yeah, I picked that one because it's the most.
I can think of cases where maybe people who had run for office at some point were ultimately, brought in, after they had served in a political role. Can you be a minister of the crown if you're of a political party? Yes, you're there to serve the crown. And the crown is that nonpartisan overarching institution, and you serve it with a political lens. Yeah.
So I guess we've sort of been teasing around the edges of this, but sort of more fundamentally, like what is the crown? What should the crown be for Canada, and
Yeah.
why do you care about it?
Yeah, here's the elevator pitch on it. Canada as a country, despite all of its current political nonsense that you're stuck facing on a daily basis, is an incredible country. We have rights and freedoms that surpass most people in the world. We have, we're an economic powerhouse in many ways. We enjoy an incredible quality of life, save the 9 months of winter that most of the nation goes through.
The other 3 months are great.
I've often described Canadian weather as 9 months of expectation and 3 months of disappointment. So Canada is an incredible place. It really is. And that is not in spite of our system of government. That is because of our system of government. We're a remarkably young country in the history of the world, and we tied ourselves on to an institution that has, monarchies in various forms, or tribal leadership. These have been around for thousands of years in some way, shape, or form. We picked one that has about 1,000 years of history, and we tied ourselves to that, and it's worked out really well for us. We were founded on compromise and peace and prosperity, and peace, order, and good government. And I contrast that to our neighbors, which isn't the only alternative out there, but it's the most obvious one. And the Americans were founded on violence, and they were a republic, and it's been a far messier development. And it's not going great. It's certainly not going as good as it is here in a lot of ways. The country is very clearly divided. And while we have our political divisions, we still have a lot more respect and discourse in this country than they do in the States on debates and issues that you bring up. The alternative is, I think, a catastrophe. And if you look at the polling, it's pretty consistent. Support for the monarchy runs, somewhere between 45 and 60%, depending on how you ask the question. Angus Reid is a widely known Republican who does this survey every year and publishes the results. Support for the monarchy is waning. Support for the monarchy was actually up this year if you read the Angus Reid poll, despite the passing of the Queen and the ascension of King Charles. So if we get into the nuts and bolts of it, the Crown allows us to have a unifying, overarching purpose and figure and place to pledge, and human to pledge allegiance to, because the king is just a personification of the crown. And the alternative is the American model, where not my president. Donald Trump is not my president. Joe Biden is not my president. Here, we all kind of agree to the rules. Justin Trudeau becomes the prime minister, but we know he's kept in check by the crown. And we know that if Mr. Poilievre were to become prime minister, he would be kept in check by the crown. And if I don't like Mr. Trudeau, I can still be a proud Canadian. But I notice Americans struggling to be proud when Donald Trump is their prime minister, or struggling to be proud when Joe Biden is their prime minister. You can maintain Canadian pride despite your political leadership in Canada. And there's a whole other conversation we can have about whether this government allows us to continue to be proud Canadians. But if I ignore what the government tells me about the rules around being a proud Canadian right now, I know that the crown protects, the maple leaf, and it protects the Constitution. And I can be a proud Canadian, proud of Canada, regardless of my political leadership. And that matters. It doesn't sound really important when you get dance around on the edges, like, oh, King Charles and his kids are crazy and all got divorced and everybody's having affairs. Like, when you push all that aside, the institution matters. And conservatives in particular obviously love institutions and the protection of them. And I heard this on your podcast not long ago when you were debating conservatism. I enjoyed that episode, but your two guests were kind of talking about how conservatives like to protect institutions, and liberals believe things can be better, but they want them better tomorrow. So they'll throw out the institutions of today. Mm-hmm. And the crown's a really big part of that in my mind. You just can't get rid of it and expect it to continue on the same as it has been. I think things get significantly worse if you drop the crown.
Yeah, so that's a really strong and I think thoughtful defense of the institution. I guess I would boil it down to sort of two principal arguments, right? And you correct me if I'm sort of misstating your position, but Number one is things are going well. We're a great country. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? The kind of argument from, well, we're doing things right, and so we shouldn't change it. And then the other is this argument about kind of a locus of loyalty independent of immediate political leadership. Winston Churchill had a line that I quite liked, which was, the great thing about Britain is that when you win a battle, you say, God save the Queen. And when you lose a battle, you vote down the Prime Minister, right? So it's this, there's this figure, this institution that can encapsulate all of our hopes and aspirations, and that we can all sort of look to as a locus of loyalty that is above politics. And that's why I think this discussion about governor generals being above politics or descending back into politics is important. But I guess I just, digging in on that second one, like, is it actually true in practice that the monarchy is a locus of loyalty for Canadians? I think that's probably true in the UK, right? The British people have a much more sort of intimate relationship with the monarchy. I don't know how many Canadians are actively thinking about the connection between their pride in Canada and its monarchy, and it would vary, I think, depending on background and experience. I think there's a lot of Canadians who wouldn't think about the monarchy at all when they think of the sort of common national. I mean, the characteristic of the monarchy for us is that it's almost invisible in practice, right? It institutionally plays an important role, but it's almost invisible in practice. So is it true that it's working the way you say it works?
That means they're nailing it, Garnet. It's invisible. It exists. It's there. It holds, the power is in the mace. Let me reverse the question and ask you, does the House of Commons matter? Do people think about it on a regular basis? Like, does your life and job have meaning and purpose?
Well, but the House of Commons isn't the locus of loyalty for the Canadians. It exercises practical decision making, and that practical decision making impacts people's lives whether they're thinking about it or not. The monarchy isn't.
So they're not thinking about it, right? But the institution's still important, and the debates that occur inside of it are important, and the work done by the House of Commons is important. Whether it's a filibuster, as we might see in the near future, or a unanimous consent vote to give someone honorary citizenship. Both of those are meaningful things that don't affect, realistically, the day-to-day lives of Canadians. Canadians don't really think about them often. The Crown operates very much the same way. Canadians don't need to think about it, but it is there. It is one of those structures and systems that is incredibly important. And if we were to get rid of it, it would have cataclysmic effects through all of the other institutions and ultimately through the social fabric of our nation. So I don't think you need a monarchy that people think about on a daily basis and a crown that engages with people on a daily basis. The Crown infiltrates Canada through small community events, by bringing attention to certain charitable causes, by giving out awards from the Order of Canada or the Order of British Columbia to the Sovereign's Medal for Volunteerism. Those are things that matter in a society that help hold a society together. And that's the role of the Crown. And it's always got a slightly different bend on it, depending on who holds the office of Governor General at the pleasure of at the pleasure of the Crown, the King in this case, on the advice of the Prime Minister. But it's incredibly important. Like, I'll ask you. So I'm wearing, for those who can't see, I'm wearing the coronation pin, which you as a member of Parliament were given an opportunity to hand out 25 of these, I think, as were a number of your colleagues. Did you do any community activities with your coronation pins?
I can't remember the details of exactly how we. But I see the point you're making, broadly speaking, which is that
probably. So this is what happens with most members of Parliament. Someone on their staff looked for 25 individuals in the community who were deserving of some sort of notoriety or respect for the contribution they'd made in their local community.
Yeah. I don't mean to diminish that, but like these kinds of things happen in republics as well, right? Like there are orders of merit of various kinds that
but I think in republics those are diminished by the fact that they come from politics, whereas these don't. These come from a higher level in politics, so they have meaning. So me as a conservative individual could receive a pin from a Liberal member of Parliament as an acknowledgement for the work I've done for the Crown, or vice versa. Yeah. Or a Liberal member in your riding could receive a pin for the work they've done helping the local homeless shelter. And that matters a lot, and it takes the partisanship away from it. So that's where the crown really plays a role in Canada. When William and Kate were here in British Columbia a number of years ago, they visited a charity on the downtown east side, which, if you've been through, is arguably the worst neighborhood in North America, certainly in Canada. It is a horrific scene. And you've debated this recently in Parliament, like the free drug program in British Columbia. It's not working. It's a bad scene down there. But William and Kate went down there and highlighted that and brought more attention to the area than it otherwise would have received, which probably improved the lives of the people down there, even if just marginally. And that's the important role of the crown.
Yeah. So it can play this convening role and bringing attention to good causes. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's also inexpensive. The monarchist
league. It's a good conservative argument. We're getting value for money out of these guys. Right?
Incredible value for money. The monarchist league does a triennial survey. So we did one in 2019 to 2021, and obviously we're 1 year out from our next one. The cost of the crown is approximately, and I've got it here, it's $1.55 per Canadian per year. Okay, now that includes all the governor general's work, all the lieutenant governor's work across all the provinces, all the awards, the foreign tours by the lieutenant governors, and the royal homecomings and working visits. Not the working visits, but the royal homecomings that were at the request of the government of Canada to bring a senior member of the royal family over. So. And then because this was COVID, it included all the virtual stuff as well, which was just attendance. So all of that cost $1.55 per Canadian per year. Now, if you got rid of the institution of the crown, you'd still have a bunch of that stuff that would occur. So best case scenario, you get away, you can save yourself 25 cents per Canadian per year. In contrast, and this will appeal to you and your conservative listeners, the cost of the CBC per year. And we put this in our survey. I'm not making a political argument here, but the cost of the CBC was like $33 per Canadian per year. And
that's hunting fish in the barrel right there with,
Like it was outrageous. The difference. The CBC was $31.86 per Canadian per year. Whereas the monarchy was $1.55. The House of Commons, by the way, was $13.30 per Canadian per year. And the Senate was $2.57 per Canadian per year. Now, let's just compare it to the Senate, because the House of Commons has a more important role than the Senate in my mind. What is more useful to Canadians, the Crown or the Senate? And the Senate's a full $1.02 more per year than the Crown. I mean, it's hard to compare these institutions because they're serving very different functions. But I mean, I take your point that I think one of the criticisms of the monarchy can be the cost, and it's now, I mean, you could say $1.50 Canadians. I mean, that still adds up to a fair bit of money. But you're right as well to say a lot of those functions would in some way have to be carried out. We're still a responsible nation.
I guess just to drill in on this point, and then I want to go on to asking you about sort of perceptions of Charles himself. But I did my master's in the UK, right? And it's interesting how the monarchy plays kind of a different role. In the UK, it seems it does have this imminence. The monarchy, the royal family are more involved in the kinds of activities and engagements that you describe because they're present there. Of course, historically, the monarchy has at times been directly involved in politics, and its role there has shifted. But it does seem to fulfill that function that Churchill described of, you win a battle, you say God save the Queen, and when you lose a battle, you vote down the Prime Minister. But in Canada, it's different because it is more distant. Is the Governor General supposed to be the stand-in for that? But he or she can't really fully be the stand-in for that. So is it in fact true that the monarchy is fulfilling this function of being the locus of national loyalty, or is that maybe an aspiration that is not being realized? And should we seek a greater imminence of the monarchy in our lives if we want to realize the goods that you're talking about?
So the tradition in the UK dates back prior to television, and I think that's a big part of it. It was embedded. It's so many generations deep that it's more embedded in society. And in addition to all the reasons you presented, which is they're just there, right? Like you drive by Buckingham Palace if you're going out on the town, and you're reminded, oh, that's there's a real queen that lives there, or a real king that lives there. But it's just more historically embedded than we've had the opportunity to experience in Canada. I'm going to differentiate between the monarchy and the crown. And the monarchy, people tend to think of the monarch and the family and the personification of the crown, and the crown being the institution. And obviously it's a constitutional monarchy. You're right to say that it's never going to be as prominent or as effective as it is in the UK. We get some reflective glory from that. We get all the benefits of a worldwide king, and previously for 50 or for 70 years a worldwide queen. I was at the state dinner in Toronto in 2010 when Her Majesty came, and Prime Minister Harper gave her a hockey jersey and inducted her into the Canadian Hockey Hall of Fame for the puck drop that she had done at the Canadiens game. And it was a wonderful night. But when she left there, she made an announcement. She's like, I'm traveling to New York tomorrow to address the United Nations as the Queen of Canada. So she left Canada as the Queen of Canada and went to the United Nations and presented herself as the Queen of Canada, the United Kingdom, and her other realms. We get this reflective glory that to be part of a world institution, in addition to the Commonwealth, just having shared a monarch with other places. So we're not the primary, right? We're not England. England's always going to be the primary on this. But we get some benefits just being around that, and there's some magic to it. Now, a lot of that magic has worn off because of television, but that magic is so deeply rooted in British history that it supersedes the television era. Whereas 50% of Canada's existence has had televisions. And so it's just been more public, and you lose a lot of the magic when it's so public.
Let me transition now to asking about perceptions of Charles. You've talked, I think, in very conservative terms, right? Like you are conservative, and your arguments for monarchy are
don't go away. Yeah, I'm pretty conservative.
Yeah. I'm not telling tales out of school here. So Charles, prior to becoming king, has spoken out on a lot of issues, not all of which Canadian conservatives would necessarily agree with, right? Now, I think his politics are kind of interesting and complicated. Does it create challenges for conservatives in particular given some of the views he's expressed in the past?
I don't think so. I mentioned to you this yesterday when we were doing a pre-conversation, and the thing with Charles is he has been the longest serving monarch in waiting, I think, in the history of the world, right? Like 68 years or something like that. He waited to take over the job. And that's a tough life because you basically are just waiting for this position to open, and you're waiting for your mom to die so you can go fulfill your destiny. And he was the first guy who really had to carve out his own way in a very public way. And again, we're back to televisions, and all of this played out on TV and tabloid press reports. So he had to carve out his own life. And he has a very peculiar set of interests, which today seem pretty normal, but the label of him being peculiar has stayed with him from the time when he started. So that, the organic gardening and the green initiatives and all this stuff he got into in the 70s that was kind of kookadoo, it's pretty mainstream now. His views are actually like mainstream right now. And I can appreciate that real Canadian conservatives wouldn't agree with his views for a whole host of reasons. And even if they did agree, they wouldn't necessarily want to see them played out in national economic policies. But the views aren't as weird as they used to be. He's just kind of been left with that reputation as a result of the guy just got smeared all over the place for a whole host of reasons, right? Like his divorce with Diana was just atrocious on both sides. Like when you get into the actual story of what happened there, they never should have been. They're just two people who didn't get along, and they were kind of thrust together in a very public way. And they were, it takes two to tango, and they were both just vicious to each other in so many different ways. dividing the kids and the family and the institution and the bank accounts and the press coverage and politicians around the world. And he's had to carry that burden throughout his life, particularly because Diana died, and all is forgiven upon death. So any of Diana's faults were ignored, all of Charles's were remembered, and he's been kind of just brought along with so much baggage over the years. Now, I think he's shed most of that baggage. People respect him as an individual. People realize now that, you know what, we all have our own family challenges. We all get divorced. We all have these different things that might occur along the way. He's kind of come into his own. I think he's come in for a pretty soft landing, and he's doing a reasonably good job. And he hasn't thus far brought any of this previous political initiative back to the forefront. I don't feel as though the king is pushing a green initiative or pushing, he had a couple little nods to his own personal interests in the coronation service, in terms of there was a couple green initiatives, like some local things were brought in, and he had an interfaith collection of individuals there versus having it being exclusively Anglican. Some of the language was changed. So he's broadened the scope of the monarchy to suit his own personal interest, but he's staying in his lane as king. Look, we can have this debate in the future if he departs from that lane,
right?
But he's staying in his lane, and he's doing the right thing. No one's.
I guess not dissimilar to the conversation we had about David Johnston, where if somebody is taking on a role, but their political activities before or afterwards, how they impact perceptions of them when they're in the role, even if they are sort of studiously sticking to the nonpartisan parameters of that position. It creates challenges for them, because the moment they appear to go close to the line, that and there are cases where a monarch may actually have to make judgment calls about things like you have a minority parliament, and in practice in Canada those decisions would be made by the Governor General, but in the UK they would involve the monarch. So there are cases where
it matters.
It could make it more challenging for him to do his job, right?
There are cases where the politics of the monarch matters. In this case, Charles was just a monarch in waiting for so long, so it was inevitable that he was going to have some politics. He couldn't have existed without some politics. And public perception skews his politics a bit, like how the public perceives him might make you think otherwise. But he's staying in his lane, and so far, I think Canadians are being well served by King Charles.
Mm-hmm. You kind of alluded to the discussions around his divorce. I don't, I was very young when all this was happening, of course, and I think for Canadians of my generation, it feels less imminent. But again, the Netflix series brings it back up. For folks that are older, they would obviously remember having followed it and having thoughts on it as it unfolds. And I think it's true that every family has problems and challenges, right? And but it does impact perceptions, doesn't it? I mean, or do you think it doesn't as much anymore? And does it make it, even if we kind of say, well, I guess their family is just like every family, does that kind of poke a hole in the myth that's supposed to exist, which is that actually no, they're not like every other family, they're royalty, and the era of television,
right?
It's supposed to be magic. And does the era of television bring it down to the point of saying, well, I mean, frankly, what we know to be true, which is this is another family, this is another group of people with ups and downs and challenges and does that take away from the magic of monarchy?
Certainly. However, a human's deepest connection to anything is to another person. And there are exceptions of institutions and causes and beliefs, but for the most part, loyalty to another person is the deepest connection we make as humans. And I think we think in party politics like you're a loyal conservative, but you're effectively loyal to the leader. And if the wrong leader were leading the Conservative Party, you would be a lot less loyal to the party. So the loyalty to the individual is I think the deepest force for the most part among human beings. And so we as Canadians are loyal to the crown, we're loyal to our country, our patriotism, but the loyal to having the personified individual there helps. And in the case of Charles, he is in many ways flawed, as we all are. He is also deeply damaged by a lifetime of public scrutiny. And so I think the question you're asking is like, how do we be loyal to an individual who is so much like us? And ultimately, I think the humanity on balance is probably better for Charles than not, in that we can see more of ourselves in him because of the modern era, whereas it was different for the Queen. The Queen always was just slightly above, in the back, higher up than, but we're just, and this is going to keep transitioning because William has had this from childhood, and we've all kind of watched. I'm the same age as William, and I think you're probably similar in age. We've all kind of grown up with William. So when he ultimately comes to the throne, it's going to feel like one of our contemporaries has come to the throne. We mourned with him at the loss of his mother. For the most part, people sided with him in the fight with his brother. And, we feel more for him than we didn't have that connection with the Queen. So Charles is this transition where we have this feeling and this empathy for him, but we didn't really make the connection with him as much as we will with William, and Canadians will connect. And I think there'll be more of a resurgence. Charles, I think, is going to be a bit of a caretaker monarch who is going to transition between this long 70-year history and this dynamic, young, bright future. And it's important to have that transition. To put it in political terms, he is the Gerald Ford of the monarchy. He's they came from bad to better eventually post Carter, but he provided that transition. He might even be like Carter as an example, where he's just this transitionary president, and then there's this, not that Reagan was younger, but he's the revival of the institution of the American pride. William will be the revival of the monarchy for multiple Canadian generations, because we love him, we watched him grow up, or for guys like you and I, we grew up with him.
Yeah. So I guess another way of looking at some of the challenges that have existed in Charles' life, and another potential criticism of the monarchy that I think some people would have, having watched The Crown in particular, for example, is to say that the way this institution functions hurts the people within it, right? This would be maybe if you have a more sympathetic view of Charles, you say like, he was under lots of different kinds of pressure that were associated with his position, as was Diana, as was
Prince Harry.
Prince Harry, as was
Prince Harry.
Princess Margaret. Yeah, and again, I mean, I think people have different levels of sympathy or lack thereof for particular figures in that, but there does seem to be a lot of challenges and even pain associated with being in the institution. How do you think about that? I mean, is that a legitimate challenge, and can the institution become more humane to those who are within it, so you don't have these kinds of things happening?
I'm reminded of a piece of advice someone gave me once, which is if everybody in the world took all their problems and threw them in a pile, you'd probably take yours back. Being the king, with the fancy palace and the driver and everybody bowing to you and curtsying, right. It sounds pretty good on the surface, but when you peel back, that's a tough job. Like I think Charles did something like 600 engagements last year. Like just an unbelievable amount of time spent connecting with people. You're an MP, like you probably get through a couple hundred events a year, but like 600, Garnet. He just like cruising around the country and the world, just talking to people, meeting them, hearing their issues, making them feel important, bringing, shining a light on their issue, whatever it was. So yes, the institution is hard on the individual. One of the benefits of the monarchy is that it's done through the lottery of birth. And we don't have this selection process where people are forced into things or ambitious people get to take it over. It's the finest lottery in the world. It's just, you're born into it. That's your destiny. And it is in many ways hard on those individuals, but it seems to me that the lineage itself, Elizabeth, Charles, William, George, is straight and narrow and well looked after. And I don't think Charles would say that his life has been terrible. I think he's had a number of challenges. I've had the opportunity to meet him on one occasion also in Vancouver at the opening of the Olympic Village, which was this whole green village. So it obviously appealed to him at the time in 2009. Yeah. And he's a remarkably charming and friendly individual, like way more so than you would have anticipated, like really an engaging person. James Moore was the heritage minister at the time, and James was touring him around. And Charles would hold like a small group of 4 or 5 people, and every single person was engaged, not because he was a prince and, the heir to the throne, but because he was actually just an interesting guy, and he could work through people and talk to them. I mean, I'm running off on a bit of a tangent here, but he's just well positioned. Like, Charles, I like Charles. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves, and I don't think he was irreparably harmed by the institution, right. Nor do I think he will in any way harm the institution.
Yeah. Even what you said there, he doesn't get the credit he deserves, implies that there is a perception challenge. But I think it's fair to say as well that now that he's in the role, people will see what he does in the role now that he's there. So we're going to wrap up here in a moment. Keith, thanks so much for your time. This has been a really good conversation, and hopefully you've given people a lot to think about in terms of the role the monarchy plays in Canada, what the institution is, the arguments for it, and some of the challenges.
I want to go over one more thing with you.
Yeah, no, and I'm just going to say, like, last word to you, anything we've missed, as well as just kind of the conversations we're having now in Canada around former governors general, the institution of the governor general, the monarchy. Like, where do you see all of this going, and kind of what is the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? So last word to you on any of these points.
So the death of Her Majesty brought enormous light onto the institution, and the coronation brought excitement back to the crown and all the things that go with it. It didn't seem to reinvigorate the debate at all, which I think is good. I think we're done with that. I don't think that's a debate worth having. Obviously, I believe in the institution. If you believe in the crown in Canada, and this is in particular for your Liberal listeners, I have some qualms about the current Prime Minister's treatment of the institution in Canada at the smallest level. So in 2015, when he took over, Kevin MacLeod was the secretary to the Queen and reported directly to the Prime Minister previously under the Harper administration. That was moved, and he started reporting to the Heritage Minister, I think it was. When Donald Booth took over that position in 2017, it was moved around a little bit. Now it reports to the PCO, but it no longer has the prominence that it used to in previous governments, both Conservative and Liberal. The Harper administration, and I forget when you were elected, Garnett, but
2015, same
2015.
Same
okay, so prior to 2015, there was a committee that appointed vice-regals that advised the Prime Minister on the appointment of vice-regals, which was chaired ex officio by the Secretary to the Queen. That committee was basically disbanded. It was kind of just pushed aside. And so we're into far more partisan appointments from this Prime Minister into vice-regal offices. And I think that has worked out poorly, as evidenced in the appointment of Miss Payette. And there's a couple of challenges with Miss Simon, but she's doing the job somewhat well. If you believe in this institution, it needs to be better connected to the political leadership in this country. And the Prime Minister does a great job of saying, how he met the Queen growing up and he's a monarchist. But the reality of the situation is, I don't believe this government is giving the crown the credence it deserves, and it has moved it has moved the care and control of that institution outside of the power chambers in a way that I think will ultimately be bad for King Charles, because his vice-regal representatives in Canada they're responsible for his public perception in Canada. They're responsible for drumming up support for the crown, for helping Canadians understand its purpose, and for ultimately its growth and support around Canada. So for those listening, and I suspect you have a very political audience, I would encourage them to push the current government and ultimately whoever forms the next government, if it's Mr. Poilievre, to bring the crown back to be an important institution in Canada in all shapes and forms. on the inside of how government operates.
Okay, so the bottom line is the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. We will determine as we go forward what the future of the monarchy looks like in Canada based on decisions that are made in Ottawa about how governors general are appointed, and those connections that exist. Fair enough.
And the last thing, we didn't, this prime minister has not invited a senior member of the royal family to Canada in like 6 years, 7 years or something like that. Those tours are important. Those homecomings are important. So again, like, this government has done I think a poor job of presenting the crown to Canada and integrating the crown in Canada. And we'd all be better off if there was more crown in Canada.
And that in addition to what the government is doing with the David Johnston appointment, which is where we started the conversation.
Yeah, so they're going back in history and ruining what was good.
Yeah. Keith, thanks again for joining us. This has been a great conversation. Folks, thanks for listening. We come out with new episodes of Resuming Debate every 2 weeks. If you like this conversation, go back and look at some of the other episodes where we delve into important policy issues facing Canada. We talk about books I've read recently. We talk about challenges around the world, and this is there are many formats in which I speak where we have to be very short and quick and focus on sharper ideological or partisan contrasts, and this is the opportunity that I have to have longer form conversation in a bit more of a dispassionate and nonpartisan way. So thanks, Keith, for being a part of that. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please subscribe, leave a review where you get your podcasts, and we'll be back with another episode in 14 days.